Hey everyone, Alex here. Let me paint a picture for you. You are sitting at a red light in Austin, Texas. Next to you pulls up a Tesla Model Y. There is no one in the driver's seat. It is midnight. The car waits for the green light, accelerates perfectly, and disappears into the dark. Most people look at that and think it is a cool parlor trick or a terrifying social experiment. But when I look at that empty driver's seat, I do not see a car. I see the most ruthless, perfectly executed financial trap ever laid in the history of modern capitalism. Just a few weeks ago, Tesla crossed a threshold that barely made a ripple in mainstream financial news, but sent absolute shockwaves through engineering departments and venture capital firms across Silicon Valley. 10 billion miles. 10 billion miles driven on full self-driving. To give you some perspective, that is the equivalent of driving from the Earth to the absolute edge of the solar system. And then some. I was reading through the comments on a recent video breaking down this milestone, and one comment with thousands of likes said, Tesla hitting 10 billion miles means they already won the robotaxi race. But that is fundamentally misunderstanding what game is actually being played here. They did not just win a race. They terraformed the entire economic landscape so that no one else can even survive on the track. In the startup world, we are constantly obsessed with the metrics of survival. But what Tesla has done with these 10 billion miles completely breaks traditional financial models. We are going to tear down the exact unit economics of this robotaxi empire, looking at the brutal realities of hardware scaling, the hidden architecture of their artificial intelligence moat, and why every other automotive because this is not about cars anymore. This is about establishing a monopoly on real-world visual compute. Let us be real. When you start a software company, your biggest nightmare is always customer acquisition cost, or CAC, versus lifetime value, or LTV. If you want to train an artificial intelligence, you need data. If you want to train a driving AI, you need millions of hours of video data showing edge cases, bad weather, crazy pedestrians, and sudden lane changes. Waymo and Cruise, the darlings of the traditional venture capital ecosystem, approach this like typical Silicon Valley companies. They raised billions of dollars, bought fleets of cars, bolted massive sensors onto the roof, hired safety drivers, and put them on the road. They paid for the hardware, they paid the drivers, they paid for the gas, the maintenance, and the insurance. Their cost to acquire a single mile of driving data was astronomical. I remember sitting in boardroom meetings discussing the hidden scaling costs of tech infrastructure. We used to complain about insane AWS bills and software as a service bloat for simple web applications. Now imagine the compute and data storage costs for a fleet of physical robots mapping out San Francisco block by block with high-definition LiDAR. It is a cash incinerator. But Elon Musk and Tesla looked at that model and flipped it entirely upside down. Instead of paying test drivers to gather data, Tesla convinced the consumers to buy the car and then pay an extra $10,000 to $15,000 for the privilege of being the test driver. I cannot overstate how financially brilliant and completely sociopathic this is from a pure business perspective. You are literally paying the company to do their research and development. This is why that YouTube comment about them winning the race is only half the story. The real story is that Tesla crowdsourced their research and development expense directly onto the consumer balance sheet. They achieved a negative data acquisition cost. This creates an economic moat that is physically impossible for a competitor to cross. You cannot raise enough venture capital to replicate 10 billion miles of real-world edge cases when your competitor is getting that data for free, at scale, every single second of the day. Think about it this way. I have been an angel investor for a while now, and watching 9 out of 10 pitches completely fail has given me a very harsh filter for what actually works. If a founder came into my office today and said they were building an autonomous driving startup, the first question is not about their algorithm. The algorithm is just math. The first question is, how do you get the data? There was a situation playing out a few years ago that perfectly illustrates this. Imagine a high-stakes pitch meeting on Sand Hill Road going dead silent after a single hard question. The venture capitalist looks at the founder of an autonomous vehicle startup and asks, how do you catch up to Tesla data lead? And there is just silence, because you cannot. You cannot fake 10 billion miles. In neural network training, data volume and data diversity are the only things that matter. You can have the most elegant code in the world, but if your model has never seen a guy in a chicken suit riding a unicycle across a snowy intersection in Minnesota, the car is going to crash. Tesla has captured all of that bizarre, chaotic, long-tail data, and they did it while operating at a gross profit on the hardware sales. Every time a human driver intervenes and yanks the steering wheel because the full self-driving made a mistake, the car logs the exact scenario, packages the video data, and sends it back to the mother brain to be processed. The human driver is acting as a free data labeler for the artificial intelligence. We are about to look at the actual numbers of how this transforms into the physical robotaxi network. So if you appreciate this kind of transparency, hit like to help push this through the algorithm. It is the best way to support the channel growth. Now let us look at the tipping point. The shift from supervised to unsupervised full self-driving. Because this is where the system completely collapses for the traditional ride-hailing economy. Right now, according to community tracking data, Tesla is operating about 36 fully unsupervised Model Y vehicles across cities like Dallas and Houston. They are running them at night. Night driving is the ultimate stress test. Visibility is completely reduced. Oncoming headlights create blinding glare, and pedestrians in dark clothing are incredibly difficult to detect. Since Tesla famously stripped out the expensive LiDAR and radar sensors, relying purely on cheap cameras and artificial intelligence, the system has to be flawless. It is purely visual compute. This was a massive architectural gamble. But the fact that they are scaling unsupervised nighttime operations in Texas means the internal confidence level in that 10 billion miles of training data has reached a critical threshold. And this is where the bloodbath begins for Uber, Lyft, and legacy automakers. Let us map out the unit economics of a ride-sharing trip. When you pay $20 for an Uber, the human driver takes a massive cut, let us say $12. Uber takes the rest to cover their platform costs, their massive cloud infrastructure, and try to squeeze out a tiny margin. The human being is the single most expensive, unreliable, and dangerous component in that entire supply chain. Now remove the human. The marginal cost of a Tesla robotaxi driving an extra mile is just the cost of electricity and tire wear. We are talking pennies. The Tesla Semi is already proving this in the freight market, operating at about 23 cents per mile compared to over 80 cents for a traditional diesel rig. The passenger car economics are even more devastating. The moment a Tesla can autonomously pick you up, drive you to the airport, and go pick up someone else without a human needing to sleep, eat, or demand a minimum wage, the floor falls out of the transportation market. I remember the quiet, devastating realization staring at an Excel cash flow projection at 3 in the morning for a logistics company I was advising. When you stress test your business model against a hypothetical competitor whose marginal cost approaches zero, your spreadsheet just breaks. You cannot price cut your way to survival. You are mathematically dead. And that is exactly what is happening in the boardrooms of legacy auto right now. They realize they are not competing against a car company. They are competing against a distributed supercomputer network on wheels. Imagine being an executive at a traditional car company. You come into the office and see employees finding out about mass layoffs via a leaked Slack message because the company has to cut billions in operating costs just to fund their own desperate, flailing artificial. The contrast between Silicon Valley public relations hype and actual unit economics is always stark, but when you look at the balance sheets of companies trying to pivot to electric and autonomous vehicles, it is a horror show. They are burning cash at a rate that is unsustainable, while Tesla uses its existing fleet to generate free cash flow and free training data simultaneously. But there is a massive legal and regulatory trap hiding in plain sight here. When you throw the United States legal system into the mix, things get incredibly volatile. Navigating strictest regulatory compliance is a nightmare that destroys most hardware startups before they even ship a product. Starting July 1st, robotaxis in California will be ticketed just like the rest of us if they run a red light or fail to yield to a pedestrian on the sidewalk. The ticket goes to the company managing the vehicle. This is a profound, fundamental shift in liability. For the last 100 years, if a car crashed or broke a law, the human driver was liable. The manufacturer just sold the metal box. But in the robotaxi empire, the manufacturer assumes the operational liability. This means their insurance models, their risk assessment, and their cash reserves have to be absolutely bulletproof. If an unsupervised fleet of 10,000 vehicles suddenly encounters a weird software bug from an over-the-air update and causes 50 accidents in 1 hour, the legal exposure is apocalyptic. This is the tightrope the company is walking. They are transitioning from a hardware manufacturer with a one-time point of sale into a high-margin, high-risk mobility provider. The revenue upside is in the trillions, but the downside is instant regulatory decapitation. Picture auditors from a Big Four firm finding a massive unexplainable hole in the third quarter balance sheet because a massive legal settlement wiped out a year of operating profit. That is the existential risk of absorbing the liability of human transportation. Let us dive deeper into the physical infrastructure required to sustain this empire. Because a robotaxi is completely useless if it is sitting dead on the side of the highway with a drained battery. Tesla advantage is not just the software in the car, it is the supercharger network. They have successfully vertically integrated the refueling infrastructure. When you look at companies trying to build electric vehicle fleets, they are hitting massive operational walls. I remember dealing with supply chain bottlenecks hitting us ports like Long Beach and Los Angeles. You have millions of dollars of inventory trapped in shipping containers, waiting for weeks while capital is completely tied up and burning. Now imagine a fleet of 50,000 robotaxis that need constant cleaning, tire rotations, and high voltage charging. You cannot just park them on the street in random neighborhoods. You need massive, automated depots. You need base chargers that can handle 125 kilowatts of power continuously. The physical logistics of maintaining an autonomous fleet are staggering. A massive warehouse in California sitting empty despite inventory logs claiming it is full of operational vehicles is a classic operations nightmare when scaling physical fleets. You have to build the physical staging grounds for these vehicles. You have to manage the real-world entropy of broken glass, flat tires, and sensor calibration. The software is infinitely scalable, but the hardware is strictly bound by the laws of physics, supply chain realities, and local zoning regulations. This is the brutal reality of bridging the digital and physical worlds. The retail investors cheering for the robotaxi network often completely ignore the sheer amount of concrete, copper, and commercial real estate required to make it actually function. But Tesla has been quietly building this physical footprint for over a decade. They did not just build the vehicle, they built the rails it runs on, and they literally forced the rest of the automotive industry to adopt their North American charging standard. It is a masterclass in platform monopolization. By controlling the data, the software, the hardware, and the energy delivery, they have created a closed loop. Every other company is just renting space in their ecosystem. So where does this all actually lead? We are looking at a fundamental rewiring of asset ownership. For the last century, a personal car has been a rapidly depreciating asset. You buy it, you drive it off the dealership lot, and it loses 20% of its financial value immediately. It sits idle for 95% of its life, taking up space in a driveway or a parking garage. It is an absolutely terrible allocation of capital, but the moment full self-driving becomes truly unsupervised on a mass scale, that paradigm shatters into a million pieces. The psychological reality of hitting financial freedom and why money loses its initial meaning is a fascinating transition for any entrepreneur. You stop looking at money as something you spend to buy status symbols, and you start looking at it strictly as a tool that generates yield. A robotaxi turns a consumer discretionary product into a yield-generating capital asset. Imagine buying a vehicle, sending it out into the city while you sleep, and waking up to find it has generated $200 in gross revenue. The car pays for its own financing, its own insurance, its own charging, and eventually generates pure profit for the owner. It becomes a robotic employee that never sleeps, never complains, and never asks for a raise. This changes the entire concept of personal transportation. Why would you own a manual, dumb car that bleeds money every month? when you can own a piece of a decentralized autonomous transportation grid? Or alternatively, why would you own a car at all when subscribing to the network is fundamentally cheaper than your monthly car insurance premium? This is the true nature of the 10 billion mile trap. By the time the rest of the financial market realizes that the very definition of an automobile has permanently changed, Tesla will have collected 50 billion miles of data. The traditional automakers will be completely locked out of the high-margin software revenue, relegated to being low-margin metal benders, hoping to survive on legacy brand loyalty. I have sat through mergers and acquisitions, due diligence horror stories where massive legacy companies acquire shiny tech startups, only to realize the underlying code is a mess and the unit economics. You will see legacy automakers desperately trying to acquire autonomous driving startups just to have a narrative for their shareholders. Picture the Bloomberg terminal flashing red during a massive coordinated sell-off as institutional investors realize a 100-year-old car company has zero path to profitability in an autonomous world. Brand loyalty does not matter when the robotaxi ride is 50% cheaper, infinitely safer, and vastly more convenient than owning a vehicle. The brutal economics of the robotaxi empire will systematically crush anything that cannot compete on the absolute lowest cost per mile. The era of the human driver is slowly, violently coming to an end. It will not happen completely overnight. There will be vicious regulatory battles, horrific public relations crises when a system inevitably fails, and massive public pushback from transportation unions. But the underlying mathematics are inevitable. The 10 billion miles are already logged in the data centers. The neural networks are already trained. The physical infrastructure is already built. The trap is perfectly set. And right now, the entire traditional automotive industry is driving straight into it at 80 miles an hour, completely blind to the fact that the bridge ahead is already out.